Good night. Good evening. Good night. I want to talk tonight a little bit about the situation in Ukraine, and then move on from that to some more global topics. Starting off, if you haven't checked out the Military Summary channel on YouTube, definitely go and check that out. His information's really good. He does a daily update of the battle movements across the Ukrainian battlefront. He takes time to get geolocated data, so videos, puts them in positions, provides a really good summary of what's happened during the course of the day. One of the things that he's mentioned today and that I want to talk a little bit about is activity increasing in the area of Sumy. So Sumy is northwest of the Kharkiv region, up in the northeast of Ukraine. It's right on the border, bordering Russia. And there has been some heightened activity there over the last few days with Russian missile attacks into that area. The Military Summary channel discusses this, that he feels that what might be happening here is that the Russians are attempting to soften up the Sumy area, and that it may become an area of offensive for the Russians in the near future. As you travel up towards the Sumy area, going north up through Ukraine, you go along the main line of fighting through, from Kherson and up to Zaporozhye and through Donetsk and where Bakhmut is, and follow that line up. Well, you get to a point where the bulk of the Russian forces sort of stop, and this is up near the area where Sumy is. Now, he did a bit of analysis as to why he thinks this might be happening, talking about the Kyupiansk region, and showed some footage of some of the areas around Kupiansk where there are extensive trenches, networks of trenches having been dug by the Ukrainians. Now, the Russians have got their similar trenches on the other side of the line. So the thought is that the Russians are looking for somewhere where the Ukrainians haven't invested in that sort of defensive entrenchment activity, and that might be an area that the Russians will look to perhaps make a counter offensive, a counterattack in the near future. Some of the videos also seem to indicate that there is a lack of air defense in Sumy. He showed videos of some drones getting through. Now, Sumy is not that far from Kyiv. It's 200 kilometers east of Kyiv, but most of the air defense in the northeast area will be centered on Kyiv itself, and probably not reaching out to that area as far as Sumy. Now, another area, Chernigov, is perhaps in a similar situation. Now, Chernigov is a little further north and a little bit west, closer to Kyiv. It's about 100 kilometers from Kyiv, and it's right up near the Belarussian border. So I mentioned this a couple of days ago, that the Wagner forces have been deployed up into Belarus, just sort of north of this area, and there are suggestions that the Wagner forces, which are now setting up camps. There's some imagery coming out now of areas where there was nothing before, effectively, and now there are tents everywhere. So it looks as though numbers of Wagner fighters are moving up there. Now, this has caused some alarm with the Polish and Lithuanians, Latvians, as they border up onto Belarus up there. And so there's talk of them wanting to push their forces towards their eastern borders, on the border with Belarus. So there may be a desire for the Wagner fighters to be able to engage with Polish troops if they were to move across the border, either into Belarus or into Ukraine. And the other idea being considered is that they may be getting prepared to come down into Chernigov. Now, as I say, Chernigov is only 100 kilometers from from Kyiv. So it's close. It has thus far been up and out of the way of the main fighting because it's on the Belarusian border. It's not on the Russian border as such. This may be, again, an area which has the Russians have sort of slowly been softening. In May, a couple of months ago, there was a series of seemingly unexplained bomb strikes by the Russians into that area. And now it appears as though there might be a little bit of activity heating up there too. So perhaps the Wagner forces have been deployed up there and will perhaps make a move on Chernigov in the future. As to if they were there by good luck after Prigozhin's advancement up towards Moscow, or if, as some people are suggesting, this was planned all along, it was a way to move them up there. Look, I don't know. I think probably more likely just good luck than good planning. There's been enough time now between when the Wagner forces approached Moscow and then were moved across to Belarus, that the Ukrainians are well aware of it. Perhaps if an offensive had been launched by the Wagner forces immediately after they'd been rebuffed and had Prigozhin had called them off approaching Moscow, that would have had an element of surprise. I think in this case, really, the Putin and Shoigu and that have probably just leveraged the fact that they were there, and so now position them up there. Look, there's also some talk that the Ukrainians may have identified, and it doesn't specify in the reporting I've seen, doesn't specify where, so I can't corroborate this. I'm not on the ground, of course, but some talk that the Ukrainians may have identified some Russian supply locations and be planning to target them with Storm Shadow, with some Storm Shadow and HIMARS attacks. And the reporting that I saw indicated that this might be the prelude to then a bigger offensive shortly after that from the Ukrainians. Now, we all know that the NATO Vilnius summit is on the 11th and 12th of July, so it's a little over a week away. Today being the 4th of July in the Pacific, where I am. Tomorrow, if you're watching this shortly after it's released, it will be the 4th of July in America and Europe. So only a week away from the NATO summit, and by many accounts, the Ukrainians are starting to pick up the fight and are looking to really make a push over the next few days so as to be able to claim some advances and some success. I'm still seeing some reports about Zaporozhye as being a possible target for a Western, either US-led or Ukrainian attack. Look, I've had a chance to think about this and read a little more. I don't really see the benefit for either side, either the Ukrainians or the Russians, in destroying the nuclear plant. Yes, you can argue that if the Ukrainians really are on the back foot, that it may give them some leverage, it may give them some break from if the Russians were to mount an offensive. But if the Ukrainians are hoping to retain their country and be able to rebuild, then keeping an intact nuclear power plant and not destroying the surrounding area with nuclear fallout seems to make sense. So I tend to agree here with Alexander Mercouris and his assessment that more than likely the Zelensky's talking up of a possible nuclear attack by the Russians, which many people are feeling is probably an overture to a false flag attack, that Zelensky may be doing this to put pressure onto the West to continue to support them at the NATO summit and to find some way to issue security guarantees from NATO to Ukraine, where effectively Zelensky can say, look, if you don't continue to support us, then we'll do something disastrous to the Zap power plant. I hope that's the case. At this stage, it's just a bluff, which Zelensky is playing on the Russians, and that there aren't real plans to do something to the nuclear power plant. But we will see. As I mentioned, 4th of July tomorrow for the US. While there's a lot of talk of the Ukrainians picking up and perhaps kicking off in the next day or so an offensive, I've also seen some reports on social media today saying that they don't expect any big push or activity tomorrow on the 4th. The reason for this, cynically, was that the Americans don't want to see Western equipment being destroyed in a big push. Now, clearly, if there is a big push from the Ukrainians, there will be losses, heavy losses on both sides. I'm sure we've seen from the almost 4 weeks of the Ukrainian offensive so far that even with the minor territory gained by the Ukrainians in that period of time, they have suffered heavy losses. So if a big offensive is to be undertaken in the next few days, prior to the NATO summit, where the Ukrainians may amass large numbers of tanks and forces and artillery in certain areas and try to push through and break through Russian lines, then we will see very heavy losses. And understandably, on the 4th of July, when everyone in America is at home watching TV and in the evening watching the news, they don't want pictures of that being displayed. Who knows? The other thing that I've considered is that maybe that's the ruse, and actually a big event will kick off tomorrow on the 4th. Perhaps the West, assuming that the Russians would think that the West would be taking a day off for Independence Day. Who knows? We'll find out very shortly, I guess. Now, just in terms of ground controlled during this Russian special military operation, or the Ukrainian war, whichever you prefer to refer to it as, just on that point, Russia has not declared this as a war yet. It's still a special military operation. But some data that I saw today indicated the amount of square kilometers of Ukraine that the Russians have taken control over. Now, it was showing information from May of 2022. So in May of 2022, the Russians claimed 16,800 square kilometers. The following month, that number jumped up to about 114,000 square kilometers that became under Russian control. Now, from September till November in 2022, as the Russians withdrew from the Kherson region, withdrew over the river because they were concerned that the Nova Kakhovka Dam may be destroyed, as it has been. And they didn't want to have their Russian troops isolated on the west bank of the Dnieper River, and the retreat from the Kharkiv region saw the area controlled by the Russians in about December drop to 96,000 kilometers. Now, over the last few weeks, there has been a lot of reporting on social media from Ukrainian channels of Ukrainians making land and capturing land and gaining territory back. Now, we need to be clear that this land, which they're claiming as being captured back, is in small pockets spread across the line. This area is still within what's considered the grey zone, or Simplicius the Thinker refers to as the Russian crumple zone, which is an area where the Russian forces are lightly dispersed, and the Russians haven't built strong defences in these areas. It's an area to slow down the advance of the Ukrainians. So the land that the Ukrainians have captured is within those areas. Now, Since about December of 2022, so over the last 6 or 7 months, on average, every month, the variation from that 96,000 square kilometers that the Russians control in Ukraine, it varies up and down by about 100 square kilometers in a month. So in a month, the Russians might gain 90 square kilometers when they take Bakhmut or something, and then they might lose that again along the line. So you need to just put this into perspective. If you're hearing a lot of information about the Ukrainians capturing a lot of land up until now, in this year, in 2023, those changes in the total amount of land controlled has been tiny, and it seems to be averaging out. I think last month the Russians may have lost 72 square kilometers in total along the front line from this reporting. So yeah, it will be interesting to see what happens in the next few days, because there has for a long time been reporting that this will be a focus point. The 4th of July happening, the NATO summit occurring, the Ukrainians having not met the objectives of their offensive to this stage. And I say that, I know a lot of people online will say, well, they never stated their objectives, but I think we can read between the lines and look at comments of even some of the American generals who spoke just before the offensive starting at the start of June, that their expectation was that within 72 to 96 hours, the Ukrainian forces would have broken through the Russian lines and made their way through Tokmak and down to Melitopol and through to the Sea of Azov. Clearly that hasn't happened, and the Ukrainians have suffered a lot of heavy losses in the last month of the offensive. Now, that's not to say that the Ukrainians don't have a big push coming, and there is certainly reporting talking about that with the need for Zelensky and Ukraine to be able to demonstrate to the West that the investment the West has made hasn't been wasted, and that the Ukrainians are capable of pushing the Russians back. So I wouldn't be surprised if we did see a big push in a couple of areas over the next week. However, if we were to see that, then I think that the losses would be tremendous. If the Ukrainians were to make it through the grey zone and through the crumple zone in some areas, they then, for the first time in this offensive, would actually begin to encounter the really well-entrenched defensive positions that the Russians have built up over the last year. Now, these are lines of layered defense, of trenches, of minefields, of tank traps, dragon's teeth, regions set up to draw advancing forces into a particular area where they can be then attacked from multiple positions, more minefields, artillery locations dialed in on the likely paths on which advancing armies or forces would take. So the strength of resistance that the Ukrainians will encounter if they do mount a big arrow attack to get towards Melitopol or someone like that. Now, they may not do that. They may look to take another city. But if they do that, the expectation is that they will suffer very heavy losses. And so they may gain their trophy city for a period of time and be able to demonstrate to NATO that they've advanced. But I think the cost in terms of equipment and lives will be very high. One thing that I wanted to talk about is a survey that came out. The survey's been done for some time, but a reporting came out of an update of this survey done just this week from the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology. And this survey was a survey done inside of Ukraine, where they asked people in Ukraine if they knew personally, either as family members or close friends, of people who have been injured or killed during this conflict, and specifically during the war in the last 15 months or so. And the numbers are quite staggering. If this reporting is correct, and now again this reporting has been done by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology. It's not been done by the Russians trying to provide propaganda here. Of the people surveyed, 78%, nearly 80% of them indicated that they knew someone, either family or close friend, who had been killed or injured. So nearly 8 out of 10 people knew someone close who had been killed or injured. And of those people, the average number of people that they knew that had been killed or wounded was 7. So 80% of the population, on average, know 7 close friends or family members who have been killed or wounded in this fighting. Now that's staggering, those numbers. If you can just try to imagine, pick 10 of your friends, and 8 of those people out of that group will know people, friends or close family, who have died in the last year or been wounded in the last year in this war. 63% of the people surveyed, so well over half, 63% of them knew someone close or family who had been killed. So with your 10 friends, 6 of them, just more than 6 of them, know someone who's been killed who's close to them, close family, close friend. And of those people who know someone killed, the average number of people that they know that have been killed is 3. So not just one person they know that's been killed. It's 3. Across Ukraine, of the people surveyed, 60% of them know on average 3 people close to them who have been killed in this conflict. I can't wrap my head around it. That's, those sort of numbers are just horrific. What is this doing to the country of Ukraine? What will Ukraine be like when this war ends? If these sort of numbers, and I've seen reporting that the numbers of lost Ukrainians are in the hundreds of thousands. You can choose to believe that whether you like to or not. But there certainly seem to be many sources that indicate that this could be a possible count for Ukrainian losses. What is that going to do to their society after this war? This is like what happened after World War I and World War II, where people came back, or men came back damaged and maimed, and the social problems that occurred from that, men suffering PTSD, violence within their families, inability to work, suicide rates through the roof. This is terrible. The war that we're seeing now is horrific, and what's going to come for Ukraine after this is just dreadful. So the next few days, hopefully somehow we'll figure out some way to negotiate and avoid a big push, because I think in many respects a big push from the Ukrainians could be the worst thing for them, their country, going forward. And I say this out of just concern for the country and the people there. If they make a big push and they capture a city now, and that's it, and they get some additional funding so they can continue fighting, those numbers are just going to increase. Soon it'll be 80%. I think in the reporting here that they were saying that the numbers, I think 78%, have grown dramatically over the last few months. So if this fighting continues at this level, then those numbers are going to be truly horrific by the time it's done. Okay, I'm going to move away from that a little bit and now just talk about a few global matters. Just move away from Ukraine for a little while. No doubt we'll be back to it tomorrow or the day after. France. So France is still battling its way through civil unrest and struggling with violent rioting on the streets and all through France, it seems. Now, from reporting, last night was a quieter night. The French authorities have implemented very severe penalties, not only for protesters on the street, but also for parents of children on the street. They can suffer quite savage penalties if their children are found to be out roaming and being involved in what's going on. While this is bad for Macron, and the longer this goes on, the more this will impact his lack of approval ratings in France. He's never been particularly popular in France as a president. Fortunately for him, in some respects, the next presidential election isn't until 2027, so he can retain the position for a few years. However, Marine Le Pen, who is his primary opposition, her star seems to be rising, and she's an interesting character. She offers a real option a real alternative to the French should Macron's popularity continue to decline, and if this Ukraine war drags on and causes problems for the French, and if he can't get on top of the immigration issues, which is leading to large problems at the moment for them, then Marine Le Pen is looking more and more like she is going to possibly come out of this period on top. She offers an option. Her position on Russia and Crimea is far different to the bulk of most European leaders, particularly most NATO member European leaders. Her comments on Crimea are that the Crimea is Russian and has been Russian, and she expects that it would remain that way and should be considered that way. She also believes that France's involvement in the Ukraine war is misguided. Now, this is obviously very different to Macron's position, who has been very vocal in his support and has provided many weapons and lots of money to the support of the Ukrainians. Whereas as this draws on, as this causes further problems in Europe, Marine Le Pen may be becoming far more popular. And I have heard reports that there are centrist voters who would have voted for Macron now moving and suggesting that they would vote for Le Pen. Interesting to see. Along similar lines here, just in Germany, the AfD party, they've reached their highest polling at 21% and only about 5% from becoming the biggest party in Germany. And again, like as their name suggests, they're an alternative party to the party in power now in Germany. Again, we're starting to see how this Ukrainian conflict perhaps hasn't gone how the European leaders had originally thought it would, where they would have had a quick, crushing victory over Russia. Instead, it's turning into a bit of a money sink for them. It's dragging on. It's causing energy problems. It's causing oil problems. And just today, I've read that China has now announced that it will be enforcing export restrictions on rare earth metals, which are used heavily in the military for military-grade electronics. They are putting restrictions on the export of gallium and germanium. Now, both of these rare earth metals, China is the largest producer of them. For gallium, which is used in thermo sort of optics in thermoelectrics. China produces 94% of the world's gallium on an annual basis. For the germanium, the Chinese production is about 2/3 of global production. Now, for gallium, I don't believe that the US have any real stocks of that, resources of that. For the germanium, they do, but they don't actively produce it. So there will no doubt, once the Chinese enforce these restrictions, and the way they're speaking about implementing them is that anyone wishing to export these metals from China will now need to register for an export license and will need to provide the details of all customers they're exporting to. And you would imagine that that would then allow the Chinese government to simply restrict when a sale was going to be made, who it was going to be made to. So this will no doubt lead to price rises globally. I would expect that, given the current tensions between China and Taiwan, that this restriction will impact Taiwan, and that will then impact the West. So this is just another challenge now in terms of military manufacturing for the Western nations to be able to overcome. Again, for China, who is on very good economic terms with Russia and growing more so with India and the other BRICS nations, Russia now has probably got, through its ally China, guaranteed access to these materials for the development of their military sites and scopes and thermal imaging technology and that sort of thing. As we move over and look again through Europe at some of the things going on there, in London, outside the Swedish embassy, a Swedish flag has been burned. So this is in retaliation for the burning of the Holy Quran in Sweden. You can see that all through Europe at this stage, issues relating to religion and immigration and nationality are starting to flare up. There's no sort of cooling off, it seems. These things are starting to grow and spread. The riots in France have spread into Belgium. Europe is really starting to suffer at the moment, just starting to suffer. But these are destabilizing events, and if they continue, then you will see that there will be more civil unrest in these countries. If, for example, if France can't get on top of these riots and quell them and stop them, and then find some way forward for the nation to feel as though they've got a way of avoiding this in the future, they will just re-emerge and will continue. And as Europe moves from the summer now and moves into the winter, then they run the risk then of their energy crisis flaring up again. Things like that. If you can't feed your populations, if you can't house them, if you can't keep them warm, that's when they will start to riot, and civil unrest will begin. Yeah, Europe's got an interesting period of time ahead of it. I do think that the Ukrainian war has not gone as planned, and that they will start to really realize that. We even see now in Western media, there's a lot more talk and articles written by Western journalists of the fact that the Western ability to sustain Ukraine is perhaps not adequate to keep up with Russia in terms of ammunition and military hardware production. And I think as people start to realize that their tax dollars are being sent to Ukraine, and there's perhaps not going to be a victory for Ukraine there, that they will start to question their leadership more and more. So this will even then spread from Europe. This will spread to America. And this must be a concern for Joe Biden and his administration, as unlike Macron, who has until 2027, till the next presidential election, Biden's only got until November next year, until he most likely will go up against Trump or RFK Jr. or possibly a DeSantis or someone like that. But he will be in a real fight, and if the Ukraine war has turned against him, it will be very tough for Biden to win that. So other things, NATO looks like Jens Stoltenberg will remain as the Secretary General for another year. There's talk that they've pretty much made that decision, that they haven't found anyone else to replace him, so there'll be no big change in the leadership of NATO at this stage. In terms of the de-dollarization of the US dollar as the reserve currency, a little while ago I mentioned that Argentina had paid a $2.7 billion bill to the International Monetary Fund, paid back a loan, and it didn't pay it back in dollars. It paid it back in yuan and a mixture of other financial instruments and agreements. But it used the Chinese yuan, the RMB, to pay back that. And India has just announced that it is now purchasing Russian oil in Chinese yuan or RMB and not in dollars. So when we see a growing nation like India moving away from paying for its oil in dollars and instead paying in Chinese RMB, we can see the tide is beginning to turn here in terms of the US dollar remaining as the global reserve currency. The BRICS nations will likely expand this, and they themselves will probably aim to establish a second or an alternative reserve currency, which most likely will be the Chinese yuan. And once that is established, then nations where the West or the US may have previously enforced sanctions and sanctioned a country by saying you cannot use American dollars to pay, you cannot buy American dollars, that would have then hindered that country's ability to purchase goods that it needed. However, now, if there's an alternative currency, which many nations would accept, then they've got an option now to pay in RMB, and that detracts from the power that the US dollar has. A couple of things here, and then I'll finish up. NATO itself is, there are some cracks appearing there. Hungary have announced that they will not be giving any more money to Ukraine. So Hungary have said that unless the Ukrainians can explain to the Hungarians where 70 billion euros have gone and what it's been used on, that they will not provide any more aid. The Hungary's also said they're against the European Commission's plans to provide Ukraine with another 50 billion over the next 4 years. So this is not what NATO wants to see as they go into a summit where some of the member states are stopping their aid to Ukraine, questioning where the aid has been going and what's been happening with it, while others are trying to form a coalition of the willing of Baltic states who might provide their own security guarantees if NATO themselves won't. NATO would much prefer to be going into this summit with a united front, a very pro-Ukrainian front. So we can see that there are some challenges there, and keeping a close eye on what happens at the summit next week will be very informative. And may be quite decisive in what happens with the Ukraine conflict going forward. If there was an announcement made at this summit that some form of security guarantee, either a NATO blanket one or by some member states, was given and granted, that really could be the first step or the foot in the door towards full NATO involvement in the conflict with NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine, NATO equipment managed and operated by trained NATO forces. Very interesting. Okay, the last thing that I just wanted to talk about here, and I don't want to get into a big fight with people about this, but it needs to be mentioned, is Jenin. So in the ongoing conflict between Israel and the Palestinian state, over the last 2 nights in Jenin, which is a refugee camp in the West Bank. It's in the north of the West Bank. It's only about 20 miles south of Nazareth. The Israeli Defense Force has entered the Jenin camp with up to 1,000 soldiers, and they have, over the last 2 nights, conducted operations there, which has been stated is to locate terrorists who have been involved in the manufacture of rockets in Palestine, which have been used to attack Israelis and to fire over the border from the West Bank into Israel. The Times of Israel quoted the chief of the IDF Central Command, Major General Yehuda Fox. He has claimed that the operations will continue. That's what has happened over the last 2 nights isn't the end of it. However, he didn't indicate that the goal of the operation had been met. While he did state that this would be going on, they were expecting to be coming back next week and the week after that and the week after that, because they won't accept Jenin as being a place that houses terror or terrorists. Interestingly, I thought that in his report, they after stating that they had gone everywhere they wanted to throughout the camp, that he didn't report on the success of the mission of having found the people that they were looking for. There is a serious mismatch in power here, and on this topic, we need to talk straight about this. There's a serious mismatch in power. Some of the reports of some of the Palestinians detained or arrested recently involve reports of them trying to fire 2 homemade rockets. On the other side, the Israelis are capable of using attack helicopters, modern fighter jets, kamikaze drones, surveillance drones, and this level of military equipment against the Palestinians. The Israeli Defense Force, the army, is ranked number 18 in the world out of armed forces in the global firepower review. The Palestinian state doesn't even make it onto the list, and this imbalance in power is demonstrated in the statistics for 2023, where since the start of 2023, Israeli forces have killed at least 156 Palestinians, including 26 children. And if the number of Palestinians killed by the Israelis continues at this rate in 2023, then 2023 will be the year of the highest number of Palestinian deaths by the Israeli armed forces since reporting started in 2004. Now, as well, 19 Israelis have been reportedly killed in terrorist attacks in 2023 due to Palestinian attacks into Israel. So, look, I don't know what the answer is. If you knew the answer to this one, you would be you'd be the richest person on the planet. But it's just terrible to see another conflict zone going on. One like this, depressing to see such a mismatch in forces, where video footage coming out of the raids last night, or the operations last night, showing giant Israeli bulldozers driving down the streets of Jenin outside the hospital, just destroying the roads, tearing up the roads. I think General Yehuda Fox, I think it was too, actually discussed that yes, water and power supplies had been interrupted in Jenin, and that it was mainly due to them, the Israelis, destroying the roads. So, yes, everyone's got the right to defend themselves and to seek out attackers, but in these areas, I think the civilian and collateral damage that occurs, and the attacks on things like the water supply don't just impact the people you might be looking for, but impact all of the people who live there. All right. If you've got this far, you're probably the one and only person that's watched this video this far. I appreciate you, and I hope you've subscribed. Anyhow, if you enjoy this, please subscribe. Leave me a comment. I try and check the comments when I've got a chance. I'll talk soon.